Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Hello, welcome to our CWA panel. Today is April 11th, 2024, and it's 1:45 p.m. This is panel number 17944, DEI and the bottom line, what it means for business. Before we get started here today, the University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of Indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it's located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on Indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with Indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of Indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty and their work, by educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating Indigenous knowledge, and by consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support, and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. One of the things I'd like to mention here today is that we want to be sure you get a chance to ask questions. So this is a big part of CWA, is that this is an interactive environment. And so here's how we're going to handle it here today. We're going to reserve the end of our discussion for Q&A, and we use a note card system to receive questions from the audience. At any time in the session, just raise your hand to request a note card and a pencil from one of our producers who are in the room. Please write legibly because I'm going to read your questions. And if you're a student, please note this on your card because we do give preference to student questions. So thank you, students who are here today. When you finish, raise your hand to hand your card to the producer who will pick it up, and she'll bring the cards up here to me. I urge everyone to please make your questions brief and to the point. And then now I want to just do an introduction of our amazing panelists. I'm going to do a brief introduction because their full bios you can access on the CWA website. And so I just want to give you a little flavor of who they are and who I am. I'm Stephanie Johnson. I am a professor here at University of Colorado's Leeds School of Business. And like our esteemed panelists here today, I study diversity and inclusion and how leaders can create more inclusive workplaces, and I'm also the director of the Center for Leadership on the University of Colorado's campus. I am joined today by Rangan Firat, who is a neurosociologist and holds an appointment with the University of California Riverside Center for Health Disparities. Previously, she was a researcher at Korn Ferry, where she led the neuroscience research and thought leadership strategy on issues such as leadership, organizational effectiveness, and the future of work and DEI. Next to her is Asher Jay. She is a National Geographic explorer turned tech entrepreneur and the founder of Hennessine, a consumer-facing impact campaign application for brands to deliver their corporate social responsibility initiatives with transparency and credibility. She's on the Expert Council of OpenESG, a decentralized autonomous organization with fellow world leaders in the impact sector. Thank you, Asher. And then to her left is Lee Bebout. Forgive me, Lee, if I pronounced your last name incorrectly. Lee is a professor of English at Arizona State University and an affiliate faculty member with the School of Transporter Studies and the program in American Studies. He specifically focuses his research on the Chicano movement. And thank you so much, Lee, for joining us here today. Just to start us off, I have a couple questions for our panelists, but I thought we could first start by just turning the microphone over each of them to say a few opening remarks. You can correct any mispronunciations I might have made on your names, but let's just start right here with Reagan.
Thank you, Stephanie. No mispronunciations, perfect, thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Rengit Virat. So I'm sitting on this panel because I've been studying, researching, I've been doing primary research on diversity issues, racial bias, and social biases for almost 2 decades by now. So I am originally from Turkey, from Istanbul. I moved to the US in 2007 when I was 24 to go to grad school. I often say that I did not know that I had a race until I moved to the US. I didn't know I had a race. I didn't know that was a thing. Because in Turkey, where I'm from, it's more about language, it's more about religion, or it's other things, your ethnicity, other cultural aspects. But I moved to the US, and it didn't help that I moved from Istanbul, which is a city of 20 million people, to Iowa City. So that did not help. I lived in Iowa City for 6 years, and I loved it. It was a great experience for me. But when I moved to Iowa City, it was a little puzzling for me that people were confused about me. So people sometimes even on the street would approach to me and ask me, sometimes people would say, like, what are you? Which is an interesting question, like, what am I? Like, it's not even like, who am I? Like, what am I? People would ask where I'm from, or like, they would tell me that I look different, which was like something I never thought before. Then I started thinking, oh, what's going on? Do I look different? Which probably influenced my research topic, right? Then I started studying race and racial bias. So when I was getting my PhD in sociology, I was interested in how our brains process this information. So I went and got training in neuroscience department, and actually that's why I'm a neurosociologist. So I combine sociology with neurosciences. So one of my primary methods is brain imaging, where I look at inside the brain of people when they're evaluating other group members. I'm also interested in how do people cope with issues like social exclusion, racial exclusion, and what are some factors that might promote people's resilience in the face of these types of like adversities. So that influenced, I think early on these experiences influenced pretty much all my career, where I was doing research, then I was a faculty, then I worked in the corporate sector. So I worked in different institutions, educational institutions. I worked in a big global consulting firm. A lot of the times I changed my job due to diversity-related issues. So that was a big factor. Even ironically, I'm studying these topics and they call upon my expertise, but I had to sometimes leave, or I had to actively pursue other job opportunities due to diversity and climate in an organization, in a setting. So if you have questions about that later on, I'm happy to answer questions around that as well. But a couple things about my research that I find very interesting is that humans, we socially categorize things really fast, really automatically. And oftentimes we say that this is the root cause of biases, racial bias, discrimination, other biases. But a lot of research shows that humans are not born racist. Humans are not born biased, right? Human babies are not biased. They don't recognize racial features. They might recognize familiarity. They might recognize things based on their caregiver, right? The characteristics of their caregiver. But our brains are in a way developed over time, both in our ages and evolutionarily, because of different social pressures, because we are a social species. So our brains are, in a way, they've shaped in their current form to detect coalitional alliances, group alliances. And a lot of social demographic characteristics that we talk about when we talk about DEI issues are these characteristics that we use as cues to categorize people on their coalitional status. Are they our friends or are they our foes? And there's a lot of research on it. And so I'm sure when Stephanie asks questions, I'll talk more about it. But that's pretty much, these are the types of things that I study. So I look at the social systems and how they affect our brains, because our brains are very plastic. Also, we're a social species, we learn everything, and starting from early childhood. And all these factors have a big influence the way that our brains respond to a lot of things, including a lot of diversity issues. And I'm just going to end it here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Asher J, and I wound up getting into DEIB partly because I have a more interesting story, I guess. So first of all, it took me a long while to realize I was human, much longer than most human children would, because I was raised wild, and I was given the inimitable opportunity I think most kids of this generation don't get, which is to be in nature more than they are in enclosed spaces or behind a screen. So I grew up thinking I was a bat and hanging upside down from things. My mother never corrected me. I was drinking my juice boxes by sticking my teeth into it. So I really had a very eclectic childhood. I went from being a bat to being a chimpanzee. Like, I just went around different species, right? So for me to step into the embodiment of being human, then being woman, and then what people expected you to be like, because then they would be like, oh, you can't be playing football with us because this is an all-boys game. And I'd be like, I don't even know what that means, because I was a chimp literally 20 days ago, and I bit you, and that's why I was sent home. So, like, you know what I mean? So for me, it was a very surreal coming into being human, and being human is so much more complicated than being any other species. So to date, I still end up being in nature more than I like being around human beings, simply because nature is just simpler. Where diversity is celebrated, diversity finds convergence, because divergence allows for resiliency and for the health of an ecosystem to be at its optimal performing efficiency. And then when it converges, that whole finds expression in an inimitable level of unity that cannot be replicated unless it's exactly that whole. So I've always perceived life in these massive wholes, and then to come into humanity where we are HOLES, like literally in these like little sinkholes where we can be only a certain aspect of ourselves when we can be the sum total of everything. So I find it very, very limiting, very stifling. And I don't think often I respond to the pressures of society in the same way. So often I get asked, you know, because I run a tech startup, was a National Geographic, and I still am a National Geographic explorer, and a female in both accounts, and a woman of color on both accounts, which, you know, when people say it to me, it's not where I go to, but where I have to respond to it. Yes, I have a responsibility given that I am a woman of color and I am a woman. So now the way I look at it is, earlier I would say, you know, if you didn't acknowledge it, it doesn't really matter, because you still do you, and you're doing you the best you know how. But I think that's not entirely true, because the starting gate positions allotted for a lot of us based on just initial perception can be very limiting. Having said that, I also acknowledge sort of the privilege with which I've lived my life, because I recently watched this incredible movie, and I don't know if you've seen it. It's called The American Society of Magical Negroes. Highly recommend. It is such a brilliant movie, so funny, so nuanced, and it's the most incisive, inclusive take on diversity and inclusion. But in that, he says, you know, like, you don't give me the opportunity to be all of me. Because I'm so busy trying to rise above being black before I'm seen as human, before I'm seen for what I have to offer as a human being. I have to overcome all these other labels first that you've impressed upon me due to social fabrications, right? And that means that we also have to be equally aware of the privilege we're born into, which in the movie he claims, you know, there was a white guy walking on a street and this person running toward him with a knife. And that white guy at some point definitely first thought that that knife could more likely be a gift than stab him. And that is privilege. So when I say this because in New York, I got mugged. And my response was to start laughing, because I just thought it was a candid camera prank being played on me, because to me, somebody attacking me is so far removed from because I've never had to deal with that, you know. So I think each of us is born into models of privilege as well, and that means we have to be more cognizant of those who do not have that sort of insulation to believe and give the benefit of the doubt, because they're living in constant fear. And that fear sort of degree is what I focus on. And then I look at how I can apply biomimetic design frameworks that's nature-oriented into DEIB initiatives in corporations. So I'm coming at it from more of, because I speak and understand nature better, I come at it from a nature lens, which is different from her and layers on top of what she does.
Thank you. My name is Lee Bebo. I teach at Arizona State. I'm a last-minute addition to the panel, and I do work teaching on Chicano studies, critical race theory, critical whiteness studies. Those are kind of my wheelhouses, both for teaching and for research. And what I'm probably most interested in are social movements and the relationship between public culture and political culture. How do we talk about race? How do we talk about thorny issues and the language that we use to talk about those issues? Now, how does that position me as somebody who's here on a panel related to DEI? Well, I do the research in critical race theory, I teach in those issues, but in some ways it's actually a much more personal story. I started off, before I went and got my graduate degree, I was teaching high school. I was teaching high school in Denton, Texas, where I was teaching 10th grade English, but then also ESL, English for secondary learners, secondary language learners, or however we frame it. The vast majority of my students were from one town in Mexico, Musquis, Mexico, in Chihuahua. Or no, Coahuila, it was in Coahuila. And I learned a lot from those students. And when I was working with those students, it was important to me to not just teach them English, but to also incorporate cultural narratives that were representative of them, but also histories of US Latinos in the United States so that they could have a foundation. But there's a problem with that. I'm a white dude who grew up in Texas. I didn't know those histories. And so as I was working to help them learn those histories, I was learning them myself. And I realized, wait a second, these are histories of the United States. Why, when I moved to Texas in 7th grade, and I took Texas history class, why did I not learn a multiracial history of the United States or a multiracial history of Texas? So I became fascinated with the Chicano or Mexican-American civil rights movement. And that's what I ended up doing my dissertation and my first book was on, right? But that put me in a really odd position. I'm one of the few white guys in the field. And is it just extractive? Do I just wanna, okay, I wanna study this because it's of my own benefit? Or do I have a commitment to a community? And so there was a lot of soul searching involved in that as I went into the degree, as I went into the profession, to say, if I'm going to teach about these issues and work with these communities, I have to really work with these communities. And I have to get to know them and support them in whatever ways that I can. So it's that orientation, and I've taken that orientation not just with Latino students and Latino communities that I've worked with, but also with LGBTQ communities that I've worked with in the past and recently. And it's that type of commitment. So what am I doing here on this panel? In some ways, I'm thinking about what it means to be a white person, a white guy, a straight white guy, really, really invested in a different world than the one I grew up in a different world for my son than the world that we have today. So that's where I'll start.
Ooh, I love that. So already I have so many questions, but I did come in with some prepared questions that I want to start with. And essentially it's like I want to take a step back from looking at DEI and organizations and ask each of you, and I'll start with you, Rangan, of what do you think is working well? What have we done in the last few years? You know, I think of 2016 and women's rights and 2020 and the Black Lives Matter movement. What have we done that we can be really proud of? And then we're going to keep it positive for a minute because my next question is going to be about what are the areas where we have had less success and what can be done from there.
Thank you. First of all, what are we doing well is that there's a lot of research. There are a lot of passionate people. I think that's what we're doing really, really well. There are a lot of great people who are committed to this work, both in businesses and education and research. So this is something we're doing well, that we are able to continue this research and organizations are investing. And I think people care about it enough that organizations feel like they have to invest in it, even when they might not be committed as much, that they feel that they have to. Because I think currently in the job market, employees are evaluating organizations that they want to join as well. And actually people are very savvy, so they, including me, like we don't just look at their diversity statements, right? I want to look at diversity metrics. I want to look at, do they have diversity representation in their leadership, right? What are they doing? Do they have pay equity? What kind of pay structure do they have? So I look at reviews as well. People also put a lot of reviews. So, but there is a lot of research-backed evidence for a lot of these organizational interventions and organizational structures as well. So that is what we are doing well. There are a lot of unconscious bias trainings, and they're not working great, let me tell you that. There's a lot of research on this that is published that are evaluative research. A lot of unconscious bias trainings are not very effective, but this research also finds that there are certain things that are effective. One thing that the research finds is very effective is having empowering scenarios, empowering examples in organizations. Women in leadership, people of color in leadership positions, and hearing stories, seeing promotions of people of color, people coming from diverse backgrounds. The empowerment is something that is working. In my own research, I've done some brain imaging studies on how do people cope with social exclusion. One of the things that I found that was helping the way that people, because social exclusion in our brains, it works as if we are feeling physical pain. It hurts us. When we are excluded by other people, we feel it in our bodies. It feels as if we are in physical pain. It's actually very damaging over time. It leads to a lot of stress load. This is called allostatic load, which causes wear and tear on our bodies. One of the things that I found that works, that buffers this mechanism in the brain, is agency, giving people their own agency and empowering people. So I think I would say empowerment, having counter stereotypes in the workplace, and a conscious leadership style that pays attention to these things and actively promotes inclusion and belonging in an organization, I think works well.
Thank you. Esther, you want to jump in?
I would say organizationally, we are doing a couple of things well, but like it comes with like not doing it completely. So I feel like it's all like kind of half-baked. But primarily, I think ways in which we could be doing it well. I mean, I don't know how to like articulate this, because I could talk about the positive strides we could be taking, which is what I'm going to focus on. And I will still talk about the negatives in the next question. So in terms of positive strides, so like when I'm working with data, for instance, right, within an organizational structure, and why is data relevant? Because what are the points we're taking into account and determining to be valuable and viable inputs into a system that is then going to operate with those being the assumptions, those being the foundational aspects of itself. This becomes even more relevant as we go towards artificial intelligence, right? So I'm looking at if we're deploying AI models within an ecosystem, within an organization, how can that truly emulate DEIB? And the best way to do it is to actually train it on the bias that is currently prevalent within the organization, right? So if you're looking at the lack of variance and how you currently model your decision-making trees around, your logic trees around when you would empower a certain person to be the spokesperson for the company and why. And then you look at when would you have a specific individual get promoted and why. And are those the same criteria you look at when you're looking at gender bias or going for recruiting a woman? Would you be looking through the same lens, or automatically are you putting more lenses on without realizing? Because that the AI can account for. But you have to tell it what you're doing right now in order for it to be able to model what else you could be doing, right? And so I'm really looking at it from a variance and range perspective. Both are like mathematical concepts in the sense that if you're being truly empirical and logical about this, if you are looking at an ecosystem, the greater the variance within it, the likelihood of the normative range within which it is its best expression, which is to say, if you look at the sum total of diversity and then what is the operating value at which it is healthy, then you automatically come to a range that accommodates all of those variables, right? So it is robust. But what happens in most ecosystems that are organizational, that are institutional, is that the variance is barely existent. It's like homogeneous. And so when you're saying, oh, we're going to start emulating an environment that can assimilate diversity, you're not built to take on that dissent, because you've built on stories that has no give, that has no flexibility of expression. And it's not nuanced or layered because it accounts for variance already. So its elasticity to be receptive is really low. Its sensitivity is really low. So naturally microaggressions are going to go up. Naturally our inability to even receive, because I remember something as simple as my friend from Colombia said a word in English. And I had to ask her 3 times to like repeat herself, you know, and then she's like, oh my God, am I saying it wrong? And I was like, you're not saying it wrong. You're saying it in a way that you are used to saying it. I'm wanting to only hear it the way I'm used to hearing it. So we need to bridge that gap. It doesn't mean either of us is in the wrong right now. It's just we have to bridge the gap, you know? And so if we do that with sensitivity and awareness, and you bring it to light in real time, and you can do that even through AI modeling, then DEIB becomes about fostering as opposed to curating towards a quota. And I think right now it's more about quotas because we are not willing to admit to ourselves that the baseline we've established has been so skewed for so long that we do not even know what it feels like to make room. I don't know to say that I don't know how to hear you. Instead, I say, you're saying it wrong. So she's more likely to believe that what she's saying is the wrong way to say it than to believe that I don't know how to hear her. And I think that level of awareness, sensitivity can be cultivated, but for that we need to be willing as an organization to admit to the failures, to admit to the current homogeny of expression across the board, and also the fact that it has served its agendas so well for so long, and entrenched power, authority, decision-making for so long in the hands of so few, that the current prevailing system is completely at odds with diversity. So we cannot play within this framework and ask for it to be different, which, you know, Einstein's statement, which is that you can't give rise to the solutions from the same consciousness that gave rise to the problem, and that's where we're at, is these crosshairs where I literally went into an organization, and I'm good at exposing sort of the missing links and the blind spots, and I did a live poll across like 6,000 of their regional offices and the headquarter organization, which had the C-suite and board in the company. And this is a massive entity. They own so many subsidiary brands, cosmetics, and they genuinely thought they were doing diversity well, okay? They did not know the opportunity cost to not having diversity representation within every strata of their organization, and how that this was then finding expression inevitably in all of their media communications, all of their product line development, just missed market share, missed opportunity. You're not even remunerating correctly as a corporation. You're not doing right by you. Your sole premise being MSV, you're not even doing right by that, right? Even if you're a soulless entity. So from just a purely financial perspective, it was a massive cost to them to not have DEIB integrated. But to map it in real time with AI was what was incredibly effective, because I had this live poll, and then I visualized it with a single human anatomy, and the only part of the anatomy that turned a color was the pinky toe turned brown. And I was like, that is your problem. You're literally dipping your toe in this issue. And they looked around the room and they're like, yes, we're all white. Like, and I was like, this was not evident to you? Like, I had to come in and visualize this for you in real time, you know? And then they're talking about, oh, how can we expand our product lines to create lotions, things. You haven't even asked those women. Of course, you don't know what you're going to develop as products, right? So I think it's a systemic blind spot that exists that is further entrenched through confirmation bias. And to truly step out of it, you need to bring in diverse voices. And you have to be willing to be shown how wrong you were in assuming, and how big a gap there is between intention and action because there is no inclusion. Yeah.
So well said. I guess since I focus so much of my work on language, and not to be the absolute pessimist on the stage, but you said what's working well. I'm going to give a caveat. I think this is working well within certain frames, because I think it's also very limited. I think over the last 20 or so years, we've seen a tremendous shift in the language that we use to talk about justice and inequality in the United States and more broadly. We've heard some of the terms that have already been used on the stage today: microaggressions, unconscious bias. I might talk about fragility, structural racism, right? Things along those lines were not part of the popular language outside of academia in the 1990s or before. So because those have made their way into the popular lexicon, they're being used in news media more regularly. My students still reference Tumblr, which is something that I've never been on, but they'll talk about Tumblr, they'll talk about TikTok and other social media as ways of promoting this language. So I think that language transition has allowed certain things to become more visible, right? Because without those words, we don't know how to describe what we're seeing, right? So the fact that those terms and others have moved out into broader populations has been critical. That being said, I think there was a tremendous push for those terms and deep introspection in the summer of 2020, right? I know many people who wanted anti-racist reading groups and conversations. I helped lead one for a Lifelong Learning Institute at my institution. But then we also had numerous people trying to understand how they could do a better job, how they could figure out how they were oriented within the world and to change the world for a better place. And a lot of people thought, 2020, the world's gonna be different now, right? Or they thought the same thing when Barack Obama was elected in 2008. But what we've seen is a backlash against that language, right? We have a panel right here on DEI in business in the bottom line. But there's also a vast backlash against DEI in schools and in business. And so, yes, a language has changed. We have new ways of talking about these things, of coming together around these things, but then there's also an effort simultaneously to quash those conversations. And terms like woke or DEI are used as a cudgel with which to beat one's enemy, right? And that is a problem. So both the benefit and the danger.
Amazing. I'm seeing some hands go up in our audience of people who have questions. So please continue raising your hand, writing your questions down, because after this next question, I'm going to go to your question. So if anything's piqued your interest and you want to hear more, make sure you get those hands up. Okay, so there was some good and some ugly mixed in there. That was supposed to be our positive spin part of the conversation.
I'm always messing things up for people.
That's okay. I'm being inclusive of Debbie Downers too, so it's totally fine. But Libby, where are we missing the boat? And so, there's so much criticism. DEI must die, right? Elon Musk tweeted about anti-DEI. There's probably some things that we are not doing, that we haven't yet done, or that we've completely misstepped. And so I'm going to send it back to Lee, since I feel like you're ready with you're poised and ready to jump on the negative side of maybe where are we not getting it right?
Wow. There's so many things. I guess the emphasis on the immediate changes. So we have a push in 2020 to defund the police or reallocate funds from racist policing departments or police agencies, whatever. But we take the eye off the ball because many of those police forces have been funded with increased funding since then, right? And so we often think about this as, okay, we're gonna do this change, and that change is gonna have an indefinite impact across time, but the change is either very limited because there's a backlash, or we have demands for structural changes in society. And I don't want to diminish the fact that the syrup that I put on my pancakes is now called pearl milling or something like that, and it's gotten rid of a racist image. But if our changes are only at the image or representational level and not at the structural level, we have significant problems. So going back to what Asher was suggesting, if we're making representational changes, or we're saying, okay, we're gonna use DEI to market to broader communities because we're gonna profit off of it, but the people who are in the room making the decisions are the same, or the investments in communities are still the same, then we're not actually doing the work of DEI. We're just, I don't know, putting lipstick on a pig.
I think the number one thing is to stop conflating access and advantage with affinity and ability. So we often think that someone is not interested in something or is not capable of something, but really it's been a problem of access and whether or not nepotism has empowered them to have more of that access and opportunity. It's more likely that someone who has not had a predisposition or ability to perceive themselves in a specific role in the whole, to continue believing they can never hold that role down. And so I think it's important for the stories of our time to be told from different storyteller lenses, because the more you see yourself as being played out in those roles, the more you realize there are so many ways to occupy the whole. And you are able to reclaim the whole of you because you can play all those roles. And what has been lacking is this representational diversity in how we receive entertainment, receive education, all the ways in which we're stimulated as sensorial beings has come through very specific myopic lenses that's prevented us from being able to see, smell, hear, feel, and experience the world in the ways that might be predisposed to our constitution based on our genetic constitution, based on our cultural constitution. So if it's not nuanced to account for that, then of course you're going to have misdiagnosis in a hospital. Of course you're going to have oversight in the space given between the driver's seat and the steering wheel. Of course the seatbelt is going to crush my boobs down every time I'm sitting in there because they can't even strap across me and protect me from a collision. So cars currently are not even designed to protect women because they literally haven't taken breasts into account. How ridiculous is that? And we're living in the 21st century talking about equity and inclusion and belongingness. So I mean, it just puts me in a rage. But again, when you're talking about National Geographic, being an explorer, what did that come about to, right? We did an internal survey. Out of every 11 articles published on National Geographic, only one featured a woman, as if there are so few female scientists or female researchers out there. And even that article was photographed and written by a man, and a white man at that, right? So where are we really seeing diversity of expression? Where are we actually allowing for inclusive storytelling to occur? And what is the feedback bias that is occurring every single moment you turn your television on? Every single TV programming out there, whether it's news or it's for entertainment, only further affirms this for you. And only recently have I seen so many incredible films come out from Black communities, from indigenous communities, and I've started watching more indie films in mainstream theaters, albeit their engagements are much shorter, and they run out of the theater within a week, so if you don't catch it, it's gone. But you are beginning to see greater representation of Asian leads in movies, and the story's entirely around a Korean family, and that's all there is to it, And you, for the first time ever, get to appreciate cultural context solely through the lens from which it should be told. And I think that's a very important aspect of cultivating true sensitivity and awareness around inclusion, because you cannot even see these initiatives in the world if it's not in play in everyday storytelling. And that means advertising agencies need to change, filmmaking companies need to change, producers need to change, news anchors need to change. Where you see, who you see informs whether or not you think you have a place in this world. And literally, all of our eyes are on screens. How much of that screen time is being assigned to diversity? And that is my number one contention in addressing this space, because that is a massive inadequacy. And the roles in which we are seeing that diversity expressed is also a massive inadequacy. And I think that's the real gap we have to bridge going forward.
Yeah, and speaking of the negatives, of course, there's so many negatives that's why we're a little hesitant to just a little, maybe not hesitant. Right now, there's a big backlash at the policy level, especially governance, state level governance. I live in Atlanta, Georgia, and the state is defunding all DEI initiatives, including university-based DEI initiatives. So I'm starting a new appointment at Georgia State to study racialized violence in the South. And we have an NSF grant, and we were even advised to not use very strong language, not talk about racial violence or not mention race. And the university is defunding certain departments that might have focused on critical race, gender and sexuality, or other issues. And I'm sure, Lee, you are very familiar with that as well. So this is happening at the governance level, and it's affecting everything. It's affecting organizations, it's affecting businesses, right? There's a big defunding of institutions and D&I initiatives. Diversity became a boogeyman, a word that's so negative. There are a lot of stereotypes about it that people are hesitant to use the word diversity. Honestly, I am hesitant to use it in my work when I'm looking for a job, because I know that organizations are cutting down DEI-related jobs. There were the massive waves of layoffs in the past couple years, especially in the tech space. And a lot of these cuts were from people who did D&I work. They were defunded. People who were hired into early 2020, right after George Floyd incident, a lot of them are being let go. And people who are in this space are even hesitant to label themselves as doing DEI work, getting into corporate world, because they might not get hired, because then you become the D&I person, and then they don't want that, right? Corporations want money, they want business. So these are all big threats. So I think we need to change our cultural frameworks, our mindsets a little bit about diversity when we talk about diversity and inclusion. Also, when people think about diversity, they always think about race or gender, but it is so much more broader than that, right? It's about social position. That's what diversity is. Our social backgrounds, our upbringings, socioeconomic status is a very big component of this that people ignore. U.S. has one of the, despite being such a wealthy country, it has one of the most unequal societies, right? The income inequality is so high, and wealth inequality is even higher, and we can't even count it because we can't really ask people about their wealth properly. It's hard to measure, very difficult to measure, right? But this is something we don't really talk about when we talk about diversity. And this creates resentment in populations, this creates resentment in communities, and that's why they also resent diversity initiatives. So I think maybe we need to start thinking about the way we talk about diversity, we talk about inclusion and belonging in organizations.
Yeah, I was going to jump in and then
and then I'll follow you.
Excellent. It's great that you're talking about that, Brengen, in terms of the ways in which DEI professionals have been laid off or been targeted. I definitely think we're seeing that, but it also points to maybe a weakness in having people as the sole DEI professional in an institution, right? I'm at a university. Our college within the university has one person who is in charge of this, right? And that is her job.
Yeah, tokenism.
Exactly. And I think back to my mother before she retired. Her job was in environmental accounting, something along those lines, but she worked for a large oil company, and her idea was, as somebody committed to the environment, as somebody committed to safety, she had to get every person on her team, every person in her building, every person in that company committed to it. And think about it. How many of you in this audience today go home and recycle? I'm hoping everybody. Most of you probably, right? What if only one person did? And that was your job. You here in the front row with the not front row, third row with the sunglasses, it's his job to do all the recycling. And then we're going to shove everybody else and say, nobody's responsible. That's kind of the framework we've had around DEI. It's all of our jobs. If we're not trained in it, if we're not experts in it, and if that's our job because we want to live in a just world, then we have some learning to do. So thinking about it more broadly as it's not that tokenized position, but rather it's a commitment that all of us have to invest in, that's a different framework.
And I would say on the individual level, like, without doing the self-work, you're only going to perceive diversity as difference. And that difference or the dissimilarity is going to be a point of contention, unfamiliarity, unknown variable that continues to create an instinctive sense of fear, of just being exposed to that which you just don't know. But if you have claimed your whole, if you are whole within you, you're far more compassionate, you're far more elastic, far more available. Doesn't matter who's in front of you. Doesn't matter who you are in terms of all the identity labels, because those labels are just aspects of you, it's not the whole of you, and you recognize that on a fundamental level. So individually, I definitely think people should do the self-work, and more often than not, people are willing, especially now, to be extrinsic about everything, you know? It's not me. If that person changes, if that institution changes, if it's a China problem, it's not an American issue, you know? And it's always just deflecting instead of taking responsibility. And if you were to take responsibility instead and be the first to champion that and say, I own this problem, this whole thing is my issue now, then you will do so many things within the course of one day even to correct your attitude, to correct how you show up, to correct, because you're watching yourself, you're living in a state of continual awareness, not criticism, but awareness. And I think there is also this culture around DEIB, which is very judgmental and harsh, which is a different form of violence, because yes, there are ignorant people in the space, and they can enact extreme hate crimes and be racially really unjust, but to come at those who hate with the same level of hatred makes you just as ignorant as they are. And you're no more enlightened than the next person beside you who's behaving appallingly, right? Because you're entrapped by your own identifications as they're entrapped by theirs. And right and wrong arguments, binary arguments, can play out ad nauseum, as we're seeing on a political scale right now, and all they'll create is two factions. It's never going to be consensus. So if we're really looking to meet in the middle, then we need to be whole. So that's on an individual level. On an institutional capacity, I think what we need to recognize is the pure competitive edge of having diversity being a part of the conversation. Because the more perspectives you're accounting for, the more sort of ways of approaching a problem set, the way of giving a word, assigning value, assigning a recognition to it can occur through different lenses, through different languages if you have multiple people involved from different backgrounds. In my own company, like the first person I hired was non-binary and neurodivergent. And it has been definitely a difficult journey, right? If I'd picked somebody who's like me or is at least heteronormative, we would be speaking the same language, have the same personal struggles, we would hit the same walls at the end of every day. Accommodating for some of the aspects in which she sees the world that feels uncomfortable for me, because I have to come out of my safe lane, happy lane, to look at the world slightly differently than I would have 2 minutes ago, is definitely inconvenient. It's not the easiest route, it's not the most efficient route on any given day. But at the same time, the value add this person has for things that I would have completely not seen, just it would have eluded me, you know? And she will point out a random aspect of a user interface and the user experience and be like, that is broken. And I'd be like, that's not even something any of us were arguing about in this whole team. We were all thinking about it in a completely different lane. And oftentimes I've also noticed our go-to is to be like, wait, because you're not even talking about what we're talking about. But she is just articulating it differently, and if you took a moment to receive it, then you see that she's seeing the same thing, but just in a completely different sequencing, which neurodivergent people do. So I think really what it does is makes your company so robust and resilient that it's able to churn out product, user experience, marketing material. Every aspect of it can take into account this beautiful sense of permutation combination that can only exist if you have those variables to play with. If you're playing with the same putty, you're not going to create a masterpiece, you know, but if you have the entire Play-Doh range, then you're creating gorgeous, colorful masterpieces. So it's like ultimately you're not sculpting with all the raw materials available to you, and the only person paying with it is you, the corporation, with your bottom line. You're not capitalizing on your own capacity to reach as many people as possible by representing the demographics that actually exist versus what you think exists based on your bias.
Ooh, thank you. Okay, I want to jump on a couple of these questions. I have a very corporate question and then a question about higher ed. And so I'm going to start with the corporate. And there's kind of has a two-part. So the first part was, why don't we have any business people up here? And I'm going to say, we do have people working in for-profit businesses. That's my bias as a researcher. In my shortened bios of how I introduced you, I focused more on the research parts of what our panelists do, because that's where my unconscious bias goes as a researcher. So that's to address that part of the question. And then, you know, Asher, building a little bit on what you were just saying about diversity is creating this competitive edge, I think you're still talking about the bottom line in terms of money, profitability, ROI, but this person asked the question of how can we actually shift this conversation from shareholder value to a broader conversation about what diversity adds to stakeholders?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. So the reason I gave rise to my tech enterprise is primarily to underscore stakeholder value, right? But shareholder value is still the language spoken by the vast majority of corporations to date. We throw around the word stakeholder and stakeholder capitalism like it's toilet paper in a shared restroom, but it's not actually finding execution. So to be honest with where we're at versus where we would like to be, I still use the language of the corporations, you know, so if you're still speaking to what has been and what continues to be, whether or not we want to acknowledge that being our reality, then you're speaking in their jargon. But in terms of stakeholder value, that I bring in more subversively. So the way we do it with the platform is that you do have to enlist as a corporation before you run an impact initiative on our platform, all of the stakeholders that are going to be part of that pie. And then you get to see when each stakeholder is onboarded, what they contribute, and when they're offboarded. So the on-ramp, off-ramp is calibrated for. The allocation activity instances are monitored. So every step of the way, you can say, a brand can say, oh, you know, in this campaign, we engaged 300 women, and we gave back to 20,000 women, but is that actually true? And oftentimes it's not, because that's why they benefit out of the PR, and then they're called out later for greenwashing or social washing. But with our platform, we're calibrating for all of those data inputs, and it's publicly visible. So then, yes, stakeholders are accounted for, and as they step in and step out of the ecosystem, they also get compensated for how they've shown up, and you get to witness exactly what that amount is as well. And in terms of like looking at consulting and talking to corporations about stakeholdership, I think in theory, they understand it. In practice, where they hit a wall on it is, how much is it going to cost me to replace existing pipelines, existing vendor systems that have been in play, that I have trained and invested into, with these new quotas that they have to now institute to truly be representational of the diversity they'd like to emulate. So there's an opportunity cost there, and they literally weigh it out in dollars and cents. Yeah. So if it comes down to that, then yes, you're again going back to shareholder value over stakeholder value, because you're looking at the bottom line getting affected. So until we truly shift out of how we prioritize valuing human beings and how we prioritize valuing the biosphere, we're not going to be changing this conversation like to the degree that we'd like to see it be changed, simply because that the talk is cheap and the action and execution is staggered and delayed. So we need to be honest about that.
Yeah. Anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, the last 2 years I actually worked in a big global consulting firm. So I worked with a lot of senior client partners, and we offered a lot of DEI solutions as well as ESG solutions. And one of the things that speaks about the shareholder versus stakeholder difference is that to convince organizational leaders to work in that domain, we had to make the argument about shareholders. We had to show the numbers, profits, any kind of business impact, numerical value, and that was a way of our convincing them to invest in ESG, invest in DEI. And it's not always a sincere commitment, of course, and that's the tricky part. How do you make it more sincere? How do you change people's mindsets about this? And that's the big challenge in organizations. That's the big challenge in business. And we saw it in this last year. They had this big ESG conference, and they had it in Dubai, right? And all these people in their corporate jets, they flew from all over the world from their wealthy countries to Dubai to talk about environment, to talk about climate. And how ironic is that? Like, that blew my mind. And we sent, my boss went. My boss knew nothing about ESG. And I was like, and that to me was like, okay, this is the state of the corporate, like these are like big corporate people, and this is the state. And he was very excited, and I valued that he was so excited to go and do that, but he actually had no background. And he actually did not really understand the scale of environmental burden that event was even causing in the first place, that he couldn't even be critical about that. So I think that there are multiple layers, many layers to the issue, and how do we change that, right? So I think it's very important to change the mindset from the stakeholder, from the shareholder to stakeholder, right? When we talk about ESG, no one really talks about, like in corporate America, no one really talks about what is the value, what is it for, right? What is it ultimately for? It's not for business, it's for people. And I think that's why, Asher, what you're saying is very valuable. Like, you're using that information to kind of shift the mindset. You have to use it. Sometimes we have to be tactical. We have to use shareholder-related info, but we're using it to bring the stakeholders into the conversation.
And nothing drives sooner, like the faster shift. Like
Yeah.
if you can nail the numbers around revenue and bottom line, then they're on board tomorrow morning. So it's like the easiest fight to fight. Yeah. Oh, and I wanted to add one more thought, which is in regards to fundraising and how venture capital and funding works, because that's another side of like what we do with the tech startup, right? Like we do have to fundraise. There's a lot of language around DEIB and about how they're trying to support new demographics because they want to see innovation occur. But what they're really doing is funding initiatives from new demographics that will perpetuate the stereotype of what that demographic should be doing in this world, not what they want to be doing. And so they're not actually listening to the founders. They don't listen to diversity feedback on what is the true product lines or solution sets they want to give rise to. If you're a female founder or a woman of color and you're creating a cooking line or you're creating a cosmetic, you're in. You get funded. If you're doing anything in tech, if you're trying to disrupt the Goliaths that are at play, you're not going to get funded. So it's because you're a woman and you spend so much of your time during your pitch meetings trying to justify every single choice you've made. I've had men explain to me what blockchain is, and they've got a dictionary definition. The audacity to talk to me that way. You know, and it infuriates, but then the way I respond to it is I just stay silent, and then when there's enough room for me to voice again, I'm like, I'm glad all your egos are done speaking, because I know what I'm doing. I came here to ask for funding, but clearly you know nothing about what I do, and you don't want to ask me what I do, so I'm going to leave, because you're not the kind of funders I want on board. And the right kind of institutional partners are investors who are capable of, A, having representation within their organization, but are also willing to listen. You'd be shocked how few investors listen. They are so eager to fill in the gaps with their cognitive bias that they will never get behind your solution set. So you realize very quickly, in the beginning I used to get excited for every meeting. Now I'm just like, I take 2 minutes to look at who's on the call, and then I'm like, I'm not gonna have this call, I'm out. You know, and it's like, you begin to read the room much faster and you don't waste your time anymore because it's valuable. And why on earth should you, as a woman or a woman of color or any of it, be listening to complete morons who don't know what they're talking about being sheep? It's completely worthless, right? And then the other side of it, in terms of funding innovation and truly looking at solutions coming from the world, it's a huge missed opportunity for finances as well. Like, investing in women alone right now is a $12 trillion opportunity. okay? And I cannot tell you how many female founders I'm in conversation with every week and how difficult it is for them to fundraise. And even when they've fundraised up to 44 million, 80 million, they still get screwed over from their own board, which ends up being all male and all white male invariably. So, I mean, we can say a lot of things, but in regards to how it finds application, the world is so deeply skewed, it doesn't even realize how skewed it is in disfavor of those that are trying to disrupt. Because we use that word a lot, but true disruption takes a lot of courage, a lot of conviction, and it's such a difficult journey on a daily basis. Because like that in the movie, when he says, just being you, no one has the capacity to give you the room to be you. So you're fighting just to be you first, to be seen, to be heard as you, and then what you're capable of, then you have to go fight for that. Everything is a fight. It's exhausting, you know, but it's like the sheer rage of the injustices playing against the entire framework that you belong to is what keeps you going. But to have to beg for every square step that you have to take forward in your initiative, in your projects, despite having credibility, despite having expertise, is demeaning and dehumanizing and ridiculous. But because I found ways to navigate around it because I started doing stand-up comedy as well. So nowadays I call out people through humor as well, you know, and humor diffuses the tension in the room, but puts the awkward elephant in the room right in front and center, and they can't look away from it, you know. So if I'm on a panel and it was all white male, I would take all the microphones and sit in the corner. I don't care. And they're like, can you share your microphone? I'm like, no, because I need these right now, because you've had your voice and your stage for all these years, you know? So it's time we had the one female woman of color on this freaking panel be heard. So I think it's more being audacious, being bold, and not giving a hoot what anyone thinks, and just speaking your truth, owning your truth, being authentic totally helps. And don't take it so seriously that it begins to bog you down, because that's the other aspect of all of this, is like, if you start internalizing how someone else sees the world through very narrow lenses, then it's going to come to define you as being as narrow. And you do not perceive yourself the way someone else perceives you, because that's just their limitation. That's where their life journey stops. It has nothing to do with you. So I say, be bold, be free, and be you.
Ooh, I love that. Great advice, especially for the students in the room. And actually, let me move to the student question that's really focused on how you respond to states and schools that have D in Texas, which is one of those states.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, the University of Texas has laid off, I think, 60 employees that are all related to DEI in some way, shape, or form. And so that's been one strategy. This is accept the law as it is and just implement it, which I think is appalling. And then Arizona State, where I'm at, we've had a different strategy, which I'm not going to be 1,000% behind, but I think it's savvy, and they've renamed DEI. They're like, if the problem is the words, let's call it inclusive excellence. I'm pretty cynical about that, because I'm pretty cynical about how they've implemented it to begin with. But taking a step away from universities, I think, because in a university, I still have a heck of a lot of freedom to do what I want to do in my classes. And that's a good thing for me. But I got a 14-year-old. When he was in 7th grade, he started the Social Justice Club at his school. And that was kind of a cross between like a Rainbow Alliance and a Black Lives Matter club that he really wanted. And he loved 7th grade. Before 8th grade rolled around, there was threat of a law banning DEI in Arizona. It never got put into place, it never got voted on. But because there was the threat of it, the school said, we're not gonna do this. So it doesn't matter if there's a law or not. It matters if there's the threat of a law. And 8th grade was really hard for my kiddo. And so when we were looking for another school, we ended up having to pull him out of a public school because we found a charter school that had a Rainbow Alliance for him. And that's a hard decision to make, right? I am a big believer in public schools. I've taught in public schools. My wife is too. But I'm not going to sacrifice my kid. And so I think that type of impact, that shutting down of conversations, right? So that queer kids or queer kids of color or kids of color aren't, or white cis heteronormative kids can't have these important conversations to help them understand the world in which they're inhabiting. It's going to have huge impacts down the line. And we need all people to step up and advocate for those conversations. But we also need our teachers to be adept at having those conversations, but that's another story.
I think it comes down to the fact that you can try to limit what an institutional framework can impart, but then outside of that, you still have all this time on your hands.
Yeah.
So then you have all these opportunities to interface. So I think what needs to occur then is supportive systems that exist outside of frameworks that are beginning to buckle down and stifle an individual's capacity for growth and personal development. So we need to be really mindful state by state of what is beginning to get stilted or reframed through the lens of those that it serves. And it's a really interesting way to do it. It doesn't matter whether it's for planetary sustainability or if it's for humanitarian agendas. The master's tools can never dismantle the master's house. So you have to be mindful of the tools that you are working with and then the tools that you do need to actually cultivate a new era, right? A new way forward, or to implement a solution set that is actually inclusive. So I think truly look at the tools you're giving the kids outside of school if school's not the place that they're going to receive it.
Yeah.
Rangan, what do you think moving back into an academic position?
Yes, and in Georgia, and Georgia State is a minority serving institution also. It's impacted a lot. It's difficult, of course, we can't talk about all the tools we might have, but it's when you're in the reality of it, like even for my appointment, we had to talk about, because the research was hosted by Gender and Sexuality Studies, but we had to discuss, do I get my appointment from Gender and Sexuality Studies or Anthropology? Gender and Sexuality Studies is losing its funding. My salary is going to be lower. So no, okay, I'm going to go to Anthropology, even though that was the funding house. So, and these are the daily decisions that's going to affect people who worked in these institutions. People are losing their jobs, and some of the courses might not be taught anymore, and some of the organizations might not exist anymore. Some departments even might not exist in the future. They're threatened. So that's the reality. That's the hard reality that we're facing. I don't know how we're going to deal with it. I don't know.
Can I ask you about foundational grants or external ways to get the funding gap bridged?
Our funding is external. It's from the NSF. It's a federal grant.
But outside of governmental funding, what about private foundations?
Yeah, we are trying to get funding. There are several big foundations that we could get funding from, but if there's no infrastructure at the university level, then it's even impossible to get the funding. If it's not supported, getting a grant, getting an admin even to help with the grant, sometimes it's challenging. Having appointments for students, being able to get that support, and especially social sciences, humanities are very low paying. It's not like the business school. It's just so low paying in the first place. And in Georgia, especially if you're in the South, in certain states, that it's a big challenge, and we are discussing how do we do it. Of course, we are fighting, no? And we mean people who do work in this space, including students.
And there's limited grant opportunities even within private grants for social sciences and humanities, right?
Yes.
So there's lots of money for tech and for STEM, but a big grant in the humanities would be $20,000.
Yes,
That's not
humanities
paying
grants
anything.
are small, the federal grant budgets are small for humanities, social sciences. So it's hard, it's a challenge, it's a fight. But we have a lot of people who are fighting, and students are involved.
Yeah, I would do the same and echo just the importance of student voices. And so thank you particularly for our students who asked this question, and thank you all for being here today. We've spent our time, but I think the panelists would be happy to continue the conversation if you want to keep talking about this. Thank you so much.
Thank you.